Okay, so welcome back. We've now let 24 hours pass, and we've completely let that flood coat, our wet layup coat, cure on this grip. And it's cured hard enough so I can't easily put a dent in it with my fingernail, which means it's hard enough that we can sand. So let's talk about what we're gonna do from here. Ultimately, what we're gonna do is, once we've given it 24 hours at least, this is one step where it can help to wait longer because it sands more easily when it's set up really hard. But we're gonna remove the zip ties that we put on, right? We're gonna trim the excess carbon fiber sleeve, and then we're gonna do, normally sometimes you have to do some removal of big defects or kind of some rough sanding. We're not gonna need to do much of that on this because we turned out a really clean grip. So we're gonna take off the zip ties, clean up the ends, and then we'll pretty much probably get into sanding and how to get the appropriate final finish. And there's some kind of variables there that we'll talk about as we get into that. But for now, we'll set about removing these zip ties. It's pretty easy. If you remember, we wound up with 2 zip ties on one end and 3 on the other. And we have them kind of each inside the other. You're gonna start with the outermost zip tie. At the sort of square locking junction of it, grab it and just kind of twist. And I'm not forcing the pliers against the grip. I'm just forcing them, I'm just torquing, kind of twisting on axis. So think of turning the pliers like that, or like this, without digging into the grip, and I easily am able to remove those zip ties. Again, start with the furthest ones away. Give it a, oops, I lost it, give it a twist. Notice I'm doing it in a way where I'm not barking up the grip or hitting it with the scissors, with the, the pliers. Sometimes they want to be on there pretty good. Okay, so now all of our zip ties have been removed, and we just need to remove the excess carbon fiber to kind of leave our grip. A couple of things here. There's more than one way to do this step. I prefer to do it on a lathe with tools, but you could, if you wanted to, very carefully use a razor blade or an X-Acto knife and trim these off. But you need to, whatever method you follow, you need to be very careful because these individual hair-like filaments of carbon fiber that have kind of come unraveled here, if they get saturated with epoxy and are stiff, they're like needles. They're razor sharp. You can stick one right through your finger to the bone and break it off in there, and it's very irritating. So just be very mindful that some of these pieces sticking out of the end may be very, very sharp, and we want to be careful. I'm going to transfer this over to my lathe. And again, you can do this on a wood lathe, you can do it on your rod wrapping power lathe. If you have a drill lathe set up, there's any number of ways you can do this. But it's a relatively simple operation. I would normally do it on a high powered, kind of like a wood type lathe, and I would use either a skew chisel or a parting tool to cleanly cut this off. Unfortunately, not all my bags and whatnot made it here, and I don't have everything that I would normally have with me or plan to have, so we're gonna sort of improvise, and I'm actually gonna be using an X-Acto razor saw. This will do the job fine. You just wanna be a little bit careful. And again, what we're trying to do here is there's a logical square place where the zip tie closest to the grip stopped, okay? And that's where we're gonna make a clean cut to just remove this excess. And actually, the more I look at this, I don't even think I'm gonna have to do this under power. So if we were gonna do it under power, we put on a face shield or safety goggles and make sure we're operating this safely, but I'm gonna try to just kind of do this by hand here. If you get a good close-up view, you can kind of see there's a square almost shoulder that I'm working against. And I'm almost done already. It's almost through. The carbon fiber is very slippery and very hard to cut when it's cloth, but once you've done the layup and it's got some body to it due to the epoxy and it stays put, you can work through it fairly easily. Make sure I got that tight. Now once I think I've got it cut through, I'm gonna try to twist. Okay, some of this is coming right off, so I've cut through part of it. I did not get all the way through. There's a piece that's still clinging on. Much like when we were trimming the carbon fiber before we did the wet layup, I don't want to pull on that piece. I don't want to do anything to disrupt the grip or cause any problems. So just very gentle pressure. I'm just going to make sure I saw through it. And I don't know, Phil, if you're able to get that clean, but we have a pretty clean nose to the grip. I'm just gonna clean it up. We're a little bit off for having done it by hand, not under power, but we can fix it when we sand. So basically I've removed all that excess, and if you see, it's not perfect. There's some fuzzies, almost like what we think of as fuzzies on a guide wrap, and everything else. We're gonna take care of all that with sanding. So now I'm gonna go to this end, and on this butt end, you need to be a little careful that you don't let the blade dig into the grip at any point. I'm really just cutting this part right down by the base, right next to the mandrel. And again, if you have this razor saw, great. This literally takes about 5 seconds under power on the lathe, but maybe this is better because people don't have a lathe, they can do this too. Now I'm gonna grab it, and again, I'm not trying to break the whole grip free, but those parts that come easily free, I'm pulling off. And if they don't come easily free, then I'm gonna keep working on them. And you kind of hear that I'm through to the mandrel. I don't really want to wear out my mandrel, but the point is, don't pull really hard on any of these loose pieces. And now I've removed that. So you can see we've got our zip ties removed, and we've got the excess carbon fiber removed, and now we're going to proceed to sanding. Okay, so now that we've taken off the zip ties and cleaned up the ends, this is the part where it gets a little more variable. And by that I mean, I'm gonna make a judgment call on this grip at this point. I'm gonna start to sand it, even out this coat, remove all the defects, and then decide whether I got enough depth and build in my wet layup coat that the grip is finished. Most of the time, the grip will require sanding and evening and then a second coat of the same epoxy to get the right build and depth of final finish. But this one looks really good already. And it's really what we're going for at this point is aesthetics. It's structurally very sound. As long as I don't sand through it or do damage to it, it's ready to finish however we're gonna finish it, and it's ready to fish, right? So this one's gonna be close. We're probably 50-50 whether we get it done without putting on a second coat, and I'm not gonna force it one way or the other, but we're gonna begin sanding it. So let's talk about the sanding process and what you're gonna need. I have here a progression of grits of sandpaper, okay? So I've got 150 grit, 220 grit, 320 grit, 400 grit, 600 grit. Then I have both maroon, very fine, and gray, ultra fine Scotch-Brite. And then I have some micro mesh sanding pads that go from 1500 grit to 12,000 grit, okay? And so basically, if I go all the way through that to 12,000 grit, I'm gonna get a very high gloss finish, almost like just putting another coat of epoxy resin over it. Except I have more control over the shape and contour and keeping my edges really nice and sharp and clean. So a couple of things just about sanding. One is we're gonna wet sand, not dry sand. You can do either. The challenge you get with dry sanding is you can build up heat in the carbon fiber very quickly, and that can sort of cause you to have to stop or force you to let this cure longer. Since we've really done sort of a minimum cure on this, by wet sanding, I'm gonna keep it from building up heat. It's gonna stay firm and gonna help me achieve a better finish, even though it hasn't had as long a cure cycle. The other thing is you're gonna see that I sand as much or more by hand along this axis than I'm going to while rotating the lathe. And that's on purpose. Don't be lazy. It's just the same as finishing wood or anything else. We're basically, looking to level everything out, and then if there's any gaps or flaws, we'll put another coat of finish on, almost like you'd wipe another coat of varnish to fill pores in the wood or gaps, to get it to where we have a completely level, flaw-free finish with the amount of gloss or matte we desire, right? So I'm gonna sand by power a little bit while it's rotating, and mostly by hand, and I'm gonna go with wet sanding instead of dry sanding. It's your choice, you can do both. Obviously, if you dry sand, you need to be very careful, wear respiratory protection, make sure you're not inhaling any carbon fiber or any of the epoxy sanding dust. The other thing is, there's places where I can very easily get away with over sanding a little bit. It won't show. That's the main body of the grip. And then there's a couple of places where it's going to show immediately if I over sand, and that's right here on these edges, at the nose and here at the butt. So you'll see I am very gentle with the sanding on those critical areas. The other thing is, as you go finer and finer with the grit, you need to sand longer and longer with each progressive finer coat. So where you can see it and where the sandpaper has pretty coarse grit, and you basically sand until you can't see the marks from the last grit. Well, we're gonna get so fine pretty quickly you can't see that. So really what you need to be paying attention to is what is the color of your sanding dust. And you don't wanna get far into the carbon fiber. You're really just trying to sand the excess resin. So this is gonna go pretty quickly. I'm not gonna talk you all the way through it. I'm only gonna work and call out things if I feel like you need to see them. And again, I'm not even gonna try to hit these edges with the heavier grits because I don't wanna sand into the carbon fiber. There's very little finish or resin buildup on these edges, and I don't wanna sand into them and change the look of the pattern. So I will focus my sanding here. I won't do very much power sanding. It'll mostly be by hand. And hopefully it's gonna be close. We can get this one even and it won't need another coat. But you'll at least see the process one way or the other. So I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Lots of ways to do this. I'm just gonna dip my sandpaper in the water, put a little water on the grip. I've got a couple of paper towels underneath here, and this is 150 grit, and I'm just slowly walking it around by hand while I sand. And that's it. That's all I'm gonna do with 150. I basically went once around the grip, remove that excess sanding dust, and you can see I haven't even level sanded the whole surface. But if I get to where the thing's completely level, I think you can see that, with this grit, I'm gonna have over sanded by the time I work through my other grits. So I'm gonna go under power and hit just a little bit on the end here, very lightly. See if I can do this so you can see it. I mean, just kiss it. And on this end, I'm really getting the flat end. I'm not getting the edge. And we're done with 150. So now we're gonna go to the 220. Same thing. Sanding by hand, and if you can see, I'm making this motion with the sandpaper and I'm slowly rotating so I'm catching a different area of the grip. Again, I want to be very careful. I'm not going all the way over the end here or the nose. I stop just shy of it. As you can see, it doesn't take much to get quite a bit of sanding residue off the grip, and that white color is all epoxy. And that's probably about enough. I'm gonna have a spare paper towel that I use just to remove my excess residue. Okay, and now we see, if you get in closer there, it's getting more level. We still have shiny areas we haven't touched, but we have a lot of areas that are matte that we have touched, right? And so that's fine. Next, I'm gonna go to 320. Wet it well. Again, I'm sanding. This is true whether I'm doing a fly grip, whether I'm doing a long spinning or casting grip, whether I'm doing whenever you start to bind up or it gets kind of dry, add some more water. Water is cheap, and I'm really just going all the way around once. Again, my sanding dust is still white. That's good. That means I'm not sanding carbon fiber. I'm sanding epoxy. But you start to see, after just going through 3 grits, a little bit longer with each one, we have fewer and fewer areas that are still shiny. I don't know if you can see some of these up close, Phil. A lot of the grip is matte and an even finish, and there's a few places where it still has some shine. After skipping a grit, I'm gonna just hit it under power real quickly. Remember that you can't put any on if you sand it off too much, but you can always back up and sand more if you need to. So just barely hitting the nose, barely. That's not under much speed. That was probably 500 or 600 RPM, okay? Okay, so next grit, 400, same thing, get it wet. Sanding by hand, the length of the grip. Now with 400, I'm gonna start going over the edge a little bit. And by over the edge, I mean past the nose of the grip and past the tail of the grip. So I'm sanding, kind of beginning to sand those trouble spots on the edges a little bit here. Not too much, and my pressure is pretty light. It's almost like using a polishing compound. I'm really letting the sandpaper work. I'm not bearing down on this really hard. I'm not going so fast that I build up any heat or too much friction. And that's probably about it. Now I'm just kind of, by hand, gonna carefully get you can see now we have even less of the grip that's shiny. It's almost a distinct, uniform matte. And now we're gonna go to 600. A lot of water with these fine grits. And again, I'm going over the edge. I'm curving over the edges with the 400 and the 600 grit. I did not do that with the coarser grits. And I'm going around more than once. If the paper starts to stick or bind any, add more water or move to a different part of the paper. You see, I'm not just flinging stuff all over. I'm being pretty under control here. I'm going to sand these areas I can still see that are potentially problem areas or shiny. All right, let's see where we are. And the goal is when I finish with this 600 grit, I want a completely uniform surface with no defects. And you can see that's pretty much what we've achieved. Now the only places, and if you can get up close and see this, the only places we have one little spot back here, a couple little spots back here that are still shiny. And then we have up near the nose of the grip and at the very edge and kind of butt of the grip. So now I'm gonna get a little risky. This is where, so we could stop right here and put a second coat of finish. Let this dry for a while, apply a second coat of finish, and then go through this process again where we get the edges really clean, sand it down level, and polish it to finish. I'm judging that I think we can probably get this done just sanding and polishing from here without having to do the additional coat. Not that there's anything wrong with doing the additional coat, but I'm gonna push it here just a little bit and see whether I can get this kind of leveled out in the spots where it's not. And again, I'm gonna use the 600 grit. It's gonna be slower, and I'm gonna use a little power here. Add some more water. I'm using light pressure. I'm using very moderate speed. And be mindful, I don't know if you can see this paper, the residue on the paper is gray. It's carbon fiber residue. So I'm definitely sanding into the carbon fiber at this point. And so the question is, can I get it level without getting into the carbon fiber too much? You know, that's gonna be close. So we're probably gonna do another coat of finish here. And so what I like to do, I'm gonna sand a little bit on this end too. We'll just see. Again, this is 600 grit with light pressure, but you see I removed a lot of carbon fiber residue there. That's sanding off. I'm truing up the grip, so that doesn't bother me, but you do want to be a little bit careful. So my choices now are I can try to continue sanding and polishing and be done with this, or I can add another coat and take it back down to this level. The conservative route is to add another coat and bring it back down to this level, so that's what I'm gonna do. Once you've sanded, before you add any more additional coats of finish, I like to hit it with the Scotch-Brite, both the red and the gray, just because it not only creates a really good even surface for the next coat of resin to bond to, but it also kind of electrostatically charges the grip so that at a molecular level, so it will adhere really well. And that's what Scotch-Brite is designed to do. So we're just using the product as it was intended. Again, sanding by hand. This is about 600 grit itself, but I'm just looking to get an even kind of matte finish all over it so that the next coat of epoxy has an even surface to bond. And once I've done the red, I'm gonna go with the ultra fine gray. If you want to hit it a quick lick under power, you can. Whoop. And that's basically it. we're ready for the final coat and finishing. But I'll tell you that right there, as it is better than 90% of the grips that you'll see out there. But we're gonna make it perfect. So a couple of things to note here. One is there's little pinholes. There's little tiny dots all over this grip. And those are ultimately air bubbles that I sanded into. Even though we applied heat, even though we completely saturated this coat, that's gonna happen some. That's okay, as long as there's no big bubbles that are obviously bubbles. You can't even see them under camera or with your eye until I sand into them and they look a little bit white, and that's okay. The other thing is, there's just, what made me decide to stop and sand is, I've got a little divot, which is not unusual, where my zip tie dug in a little bit when I snugged the grip up there on the nose of the grip. And still some places where there's some little gaps and valleys. I didn't get quite enough finish up here for us to get away with one coat, so we'll hit it with another coat. And most of them will require a second coat. This one was just very close. I could possibly go ahead and get away with it, but I just don't want to push it, and I want to make sure I'm teaching you rod builders good habits so you'll have a good outcome every time. If I were to try to finish this and I missed it, I would ruin it, and I'd be starting over. So that's a risk I personally might be willing to take, but I don't want that to be our footage. So we're gonna mix another batch finish. We're gonna apply it again the same way we did, and let that set, and we'll come back and do the final finish coat after it's set for at least 24 hours. Welcome back. So we have now let our carbon fiber grip, the second coat we applied, so one coat for wet layup and the second coat after we sanded, purely for finishing. And the grip actually looks really good. It looks better than 99% of the homemade carbon fiber grips I've seen before. But that said, we're gonna sand it down, we're gonna remove a little weight, we're gonna get it even better. And I also wanna just take you through some finishing options, which to me is one of the real advantages of making your own grips, is you can control how it feels and how it looks, from a matte finish all the way to a very high gloss, wet looking finish, depending on how you complete your final finish and what you want it to look like. So again, we're gonna wet sand, and exactly like we did the first time, I'm gonna go through a progression of grits. I'm gonna do a lot more hand sanding than power sanding, although I will do a bit of both. And remember that as I progress through the grits, and once again, we're using 150, 220, 320, 400, 600, maroon Scotch Brite, gray Scotch Brite, which is very fine and ultra fine. And then we've got some micro mesh sanding pads, and we're gonna go through different levels of that to get the different levels of final finish. We may sort of speed some of this up so you don't have to watch all of it, but remember, I'm gonna dwell the least on the coarsest finish, do the least amount of sanding with that, and as I get into finer and finer grits, I'll spend more time with each one, and that's just what you gotta do to get this executed right. So with that, we'll jump in. We've essentially gone through about 800 grit at this point, and if you're happy, you could stop right here. We're gonna keep going so that I can show you how you can get some other levels of finish on this thing, and we're gonna go back to wet sanding with the micro mesh. So if you look closely here, we deliberately put a bunch of finish off the end of the grip and onto the mandrel. I like to use a skew chisel to clean that up a little bit, and I don't have one here, so I'm just gonna use this razor saw. And again, if you think about a flat surface at the front of the grip like you would butt a winding check up to, I'm not cutting carbon fiber like making a statue out of stone. I'm removing epoxy to get the shape I want at the nose of the grip. Gentle pressure, low speed, no problem. Now that I've sort of made the cut, clean it up by hand. Again, you see all this, I guess you could call it sawdust, is white, because I'm not cutting any carbon fiber. I'm only cutting epoxy. And it's, of course, not wanting to cooperate. Very careful with sharp things, kids. There we go. So I'm peeling off a shaped piece that almost looks like a winding check, just comes right off. And now if you look, I've got a pretty square edge, and I will begin to, with my 600 grit, start to dress that front of that as well. Again, I want to be very careful. I am getting a little bit of carbon fiber residue there, but that's just now as we proceed to the finished grip, we want to make sure, I'm going to take this tool rest off. We want to make sure that we polish or matte or whatever level of finish we want to get to all parts of it. We don't want the grip to be one surface or one finish and the very nose of the grip to be a different one, or the very back of the grip to be a different one, right? I know that sort of intuitively makes sense, but you got to work to make sure that you execute on that. So if you buy these micro mesh sanding pads, they come in different grits from 1500 down to 12,000. We're going to start with the most coarse, which is 1500 grit, which is fine, but wet it and just start hand sanding. And again, you'll be able to see that you're getting a lot of residue off the grip without a lot of pressure. Just keep the pad wet and just keep sanding. And really at this point, you'd be right to think of it as you're not sanding or shaping anymore. You're really just kind of polishing or surface finishing. But I'm going to polish all the way around, and again, I'm slowly rotating the grip while sanding. And I get a very uniform matte finish on all surfaces. Now I am going to also do a little bit of sanding under light power, mostly with a focus on these ends and edges. Very light pressure. Plenty of water, very light pressure. And so now we're to the point, if at any point you're happy with the finish and it's what you want, this is a nice, fairly heavy matte finish, you could be done. You could stop now. We're going to progress a little further, just as much to show you the finishes you get as anything else, and to give you some options to think about. So now I'm going to the 1800 grit pad, and again, I'm going to get the whole thing uniformly by hand, including the ends. And interestingly enough, it's probably too subtle for you guys to see. We might be able to see it on a close-up. I'll see if I can show it to you on a, but some of my sanding residue, as fine as it is, has turned a little grayish, okay? Well, it's still too fine to show. But I'm into the carbon fiber a little bit at the nose and the tail of the grip. Same thing as with the last grade. I'm gonna hit it with a little bit of power sanding. Again, probably keeping it well under 600 RPM, light pressure. Whoop. Get it all over my shirt. All right. One of the things that I like to do as I'm working is check the pad, and as if I look at that pad now, when I worked on that end, I got a little gray, which means I'm into the carbon fiber down here on the corner, which is where you always get into the carbon fiber a little bit. But I just want to be very mindful of that and very careful. We don't want to over sand any particular area. You'll sort of notice, so I'm going to go ahead and call it out, that the finer I go, the longer I use each one. You have to do more work with the finer grit. So I will use the 1500 grit, the least of all of these pads I'm using. As they get finer, you gotta work with it a little longer. But again, this is just gentle pressure, plenty of water. Again, it's really important. With the sandpaper, you can choose to dry sand if you want. You just need to be really careful not to build up heat, which softens your finish, or can when it's not completely cross-linked yet, and sort of makes it harder to get a consistent finish. You have to wet sand with these micro mesh, so don't even think about dry sanding with these, you will ruin them. And again, don't put too much pressure on them or you can ruin them that way too. I can just barely discern sanding marks. So we're gonna go one more grit and then we may mask off a section and let that be our matte finish. I've now gone to the 3200 grit. And again, this is slow because I'm talking. It doesn't take me that long to burn through one of these, especially once you get the hang of it. Like anything, there's a learning curve. You'll probably sand through and ruin one or two. You may make a mistake with trimming ends or something and ruin one or two. Don't get discouraged. Just keep working. Like anything else, I'm sure your coats of finish you put on your 10th rod were a lot better than your first and second rod. This will be the same. The worst one you ever make will be your first one. Don't be afraid to scrap it. Learn in the process and make another one without making the same mistakes, right? Okay, so now what I've done, just for demonstration purposes, is I have taped off a third of this grip, and we're gonna leave that at this level of matte, which is through like the 3200 grit. We're gonna continue to polish and sand this upward 2/3, and at some point we'll stop and mask this off and go to the final kind of level of finish, so FYI. All right, so now we have finished sanding. Hopefully that was helpful. I mean, it is a little bit of work, but it's just work, right? And I think the value is that once you learn how to do that, you can create any finish you want. Couple that with the fact that when you're able to fabricate your own grips, you can make any shape you want. And we may do some work in the future to show you the ways you can add some color or flash to these grips as well, and some other options and construction techniques. And so, again, I'm delighted that prefabricated carbon fiber grips are available, because I think they, open the door for a lot of folks who don't want to spend the time or don't have the equipment or just really like what they're able to buy commercially. But there's still a lot of value in being able to make your own and make something truly custom. So hopefully that was helpful. A couple of things to think about. So when it comes to using your beautiful new grip that you fabricated, you do need to understand that there's a couple of things that are different about it. One is they ream differently than cork or EVA. Like if you're gonna ream a cork grip, you usually ream it so it just fits in the place you're gonna glue it. Wet that area with adhesive and sort of slide the grip down. These grips do not stretch, so you actually have to ream them not to fit right above where you want them to end up, but right where you want them to end up. The other thing is you got to be mindful that the nose of the grip or the tail, anywhere you've got carbon fiber, the carbon fiber is actually really sharp. And so if you go to ream this grip to try to position it where you want it on the blank, you're going to want to take some sandpaper, 220 grit is fine, and just deburr the edge of that grip. Because if you go to try to slide it in place, you may scratch up and bark up the finish of your rod blank. So I warned you, be careful. Once you get used to it, once you understand how to avoid it, it's very easy, but be careful with that. The other thing is cutting the inlets in these is a little bit different. And so there's lots of ways to do it. So the simplest way is if you have a Dremel tool or another rotary tool, and you just sort of, once you take it off the mandrel, start slowly expanding the cavity where the mandrel was and create an inlet until whatever hood, in this example would be an up-locking fly seat or something that you're trying to get to fit, and that works great. The other way to do it that is really fast and yields a very precise result but requires power equipment is I will chuck either a Forstner bit or a spade bit. These are both 20 millimeter, which exactly fit a Lemke LC1 fly seat, which is a fly seat I love to use. But whatever fly seat you're using, if you can get a bit that exactly fits the hood size, metric or SAE, you can chuck this into your lathe, mount your grip loosely on a mandrel that has a 60-degree live taper in it, mount that onto the bit, and then you can literally turn the bit on and feed the grip carefully into the spinning bit using the mandrel to center it and hold it in place, and it cuts a very clean inlet. We don't have the equipment to demonstrate that here on set, but if you can conceptualize what I'm talking about, just know that that can yield a very quick, very clean, consistent result every single time. But you can also just do it by hand. Obviously, when working with any power tools, you want to wear appropriate eye protection, respiratory protection, hearing protection, don't cut your fingers off, et cetera, et cetera. But those are the ways that I like to inlet these grips, excuse me. In terms of mounting them, I like paste epoxy. The grips are really rigid, they have no flex, and I want to mount them with a very strong adhesive, so I like Rod Bond or the Gen 4 VMX Fusion. Either one of those, a really heavy duty paste type epoxy, glue it in place. And I like to use enough glue that I get a little bit of squeeze out so I know that the whole area is sort of coated and saturated. So really the only other things to look at are a couple of things I'd call out. One is I have found over time, I typically do not use a winding check, either aluminum or rubber, against any carbon fiber seat. Or grip, excuse me. I will literally wrap size 8 thread right up to and even butting under the grip once it's permanently mounted in place and I'm going to do thread work and finish. Experiment on your own, but that looks better to me and over time does not crack with use. When I have tried to use aluminum winding checks, especially, and to a lesser degree rubber or vinyl winding checks, I think it's because of how rigid this grip is, but you sometimes get some cracking or checking of the finish right in front of the grip at that winding check, and I do not get that when I leave them out. So again, it's totally personal preference. Try it out, see what works for you, do whatever you want to do, it's your grip, but that's what works best for me. And then finally, just because the grip's made of carbon fiber doesn't mean our aesthetic sort of rules of good, sound, technical building go out the window. You need to be careful when you ream these things. They need to be concentric and centered on the blank, and the fit and finish of whatever you're going to inlet or butt into them needs to be just as good as it would be if you were using EVA or if you were using cork. All right, so thanks very much for tuning in. Really appreciate your attention. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Mudhole customer service team. They're great, always available, happy to help, or you can reach out to Mudhole through any of their social media platforms. And until the next time, tight wraps and tight lines.